Chapter 3 of the Adventures of a Bear, and a Great Bear, too. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Adventures of a Bear, and a Great Bear, too, by Alfred Elwes. Town Life. Bruin woke up next morning with so uncomfortable a feeling of soreness from the rough treatment he had received that it was with some difficulty he was enabled to move his heavy limbs, and he found sitting so unpleasant a posture that he lay stretched across 2 or 3 branches for several hours, and, in a very ill humor indeed, watched the activity displayed beneath and around him. Now a stealthy fox, upon some foraging expedition, would come creeping along, his footfall scarcely heard on the withered leaves and dead branches. Now a timid mouse would leap nimbly by, and at the least signal of danger would disappear, as if by enchantment. Then a frolicsome squirrel, vaulting as fearlessly from bough to bough as if he were not 50 feet from the ground, would arouse him for a minute from his sulky mood, and light up his fierce eyes with an expression of interest, which, it was very clear, had no higher source than a hope that the little tumbler might fall down and break his neck, for daring to be in such a good humor. But the birds, above all, excited his anger, for seeing them flying about gaily in the sun, which tinged the tops of the trees so gloriously, Bruin actually growled with indignation, a sound which nearly caused that accident to Master Squirrel, that our ungracious hero had desired for him, so terribly was he frightened. A few days thus spent sufficiently recovered him to render him capable of moving, when he descended from his temporary hospital, and, with the aid of a thick staff, which he had provided himself for the purpose, set off once more, supplying his wants in the way of food with such edibles as fell in his way, a bear not being remarkably particular concerning its quality or kind. One only thought now possessed him, that of quitting the wooded ground where his life had hitherto been passed, and reaching one of those spots where, as he had heard his parents relate, animals of various kinds congregate together and live in habitations raised by their own ingenuity. In fact, a city. At least, he thought, if what I have heard of such places be true, and that merit of every kind is certain there to meet its reward, and be properly appreciated, I shall stand a better chance than my neighbors. With this reflection, he shuffled on a little quicker, and the reader, who has been thus allowed a private view of his motives, will observe that modesty was not among Bruin's list of virtues. After a day's march, with sundry restings by the way, for he was not in good travelling order, he reached the outskirts of the wood, and when he got beyond it, he stood still to mark the prospect, which was, in sooth, a very charming one, and the more striking to him, as being so entirely novel. As he stood on a rising ground, the scene lay beneath, and the sun, which was nearing the horizon, darted his level beams through a gentle mist that was beginning to rise from the valley, and made a wondrous golden haze, shedding beauty over every object within its influence. A silvery brook ran from some distant hills, and, after numerous windings, spread into a broad pond, then narrowing again, with an abrupt fall or two, which made its pace the faster. It ran noiselessly through some green meadows, where cattle and horses were grazing, then made a bend into the wood, where it was lost to view. Bruin's quick eye scarcely, however, watched its course, for his whole attention was riveted on what to him was of more interest, the city to which his weary steps were directed. It stood upon the margin of the rivulet, just before its waters expanded into the little lake, and seemed to occupy a considerable extent of ground. It was neither handsomely nor regularly built, yet it had an imposing effect as a whole, and in Bruin's eyes seemed to need nothing in the way of architecture. Its inhabitants, I may observe in passing, were principally descendants of canine tribes, with a few pussies who, for some worldly advantage, had overcome their prejudices to such society, and a flock or two of birds. As the latter, however, were of a volatile disposition, and were constantly on the move, they resided principally in the higher portions of the city, so that they might come and go without interfering with the steadier habits of the animal population. Several horses and black cattle resided in the environs, but, with the exception of a donkey or two, rarely entered the town, for they found few inducements in the noisy streets to compensate them for the charm and tranquillity of a rural life. After contemplating the scene for some time, Bruin slowly descended the hill, his confidence in his own powers somewhat weakened, now he was in sight of the spot where they were to be called into action. One reason for this slight depression of his spirits arising, probably, from his ignorance of the dwellers in the great city, for the intelligence just communicated to the reader was, at that time, totally unknown to him. The strange appearance, also, of every creature he now met, contributed to abash him, for everyone who had any pretensions to respectability wore over the coats with which nature had provided them clothes of a cut that looked wonderful in the eyes of the untutored Bruin. His own aspect was, meanwhile, not less odd in the opinion of the more civilized animals. His untrimmed hair and beard, his ragged coat, his queer gait, and the unrestrained gape of wonder with which he stared around him were sufficient to excite the attention of the most indifferent, and it was with a tolerably large train at his heels that he reached the entrance to the principal street. Here, crowds of well-dressed dogs, both male and female, the latter always well attended, were walking about or idling the time away. Town-bred puppies, with insolent stare, were lounging at every turn, their delicate paws proving how little they were used to labor. On one side, Bruin observed a gracefully proportioned white cat, veiled, gliding demurely along, whilst a strong tabby, her nurse, purred behind, with 3 little kittens in her arms, mewing to their heart's content. And on the other, several huge mastiffs, stalking gravely in a row, like policemen in our London streets going to their beats, the animals to which they have been compared being bound on a similar errand. These various sights proved to Bruin that there must be a different agency at work to that which existed in his native forest. He was wise enough to perceive that mere animal force was not likely to succeed here or hold the same position as it did in the land where he was born and had spent his earlier years. The appearances of wealth on one hand, the evidences of a soldier-like discipline and order on the other, convinced him that this was no place to vent his ill-humor by an exhibition of brute strength, for that it was sure to be more than its match, whilst the uncertainty of the punishment which would attend such outbreak, provided it were indulged in, made him resolve, at least, to put a curb upon his public conduct. This was the first great step in Bruin's education, a step, alas, merely taught him by his fears. Had it sprung from higher sources, there would have been a chance of its doing permanent good. But what solid benefit can be reckoned on or attained which arises from such a motive? The attention that the rough stranger from a distant country met with from the civilized population of Caneville, for that, or something like it, was the name of the city, was beginning to be rather irksome to him. Every lady dog, as she passed him, seemed anxious to allow him plenty of room. The 3 kittens in arms, at sight of him, set up a chorus of cries, which their nurse tried in vain to appease. A mastiff, who was on guard on the opposite side of the way, seemed very much inclined to interfere for the preservation of public peace, whilst a couple of puppies, touched off in the extreme of the then prevailing fashion at Caneville, turned up their noses and their tails, in a way which seemed to render it perfectly marvelous how they kept upon their legs. All this was sufficiently irritating, even to the most good-natured of beings, and Bruin found it especially hard to bear. He was assisted, however, in his prudential resolution to abstain from any outward exhibition of wrath, by a sound which was as new to his ear as it was exciting to his feelings. It came from the upper end of the street, where a crowd had assembled, and, as everyone in his neighborhood seemed to think the amusement it promised would be of a more interesting kind than baiting a bear, and had hastened in the direction whence it proceeded, Bruin thought he could not do better than follow their example. On reaching the spot, his great height enabled him to get a view of what was going on, and, as he pressed forward, the animals with which he came in contact gladly made way at his approach, so that, in a few seconds, he stood in the front row of a large circle, the center of which was occupied by a fat, overgrown pig, with an astonishingly long snout and a couple of rings through it by way of ornament. 2 equally long ears, that had evidently been submitted to some curious operation, for they were slit in various places, and hung down from his head like uncombed locks of hair, and a pair of very sharp little eyes, which seemed to have the unpleasant power of piercing right through you, if, in their incessant wanderings, they chanced to catch a look from your own. It was very evident that this animal, who was quite a savant, or, as we should say, a learned pig, enjoyed a high reputation in the community of Caneville, where he had been settled some time, and whenever, as now, he chose to make an outdoor exhibition of himself and his powers, he was certain of a very full audience. Behind him stood a punchy little bulldog, with an inflamed countenance, evidently caused by too close application to a mouth organ, arranged in such a way as to be at a convenient distance from his capacious muzzle, and before him was a drum, an article on which Bruin looked with a curious and most ludicrous expression of physiognomy. As he was now in the foremost van, he gradually edged nearer and nearer to the object of his attraction, whilst the learned beast was making preparations for a grand display. And just as Bruin had reached the place where the drummer had taken his stand, Herr Schwein, so was he called, gave orders for a flourish of music by way of opening the performance. But how describe the effect which the sound produced on our bear? At the first stroke of the stick on the drum, he leaped from the ground as if he had been shot. Then, giving utterance to a prolonged howl, he began dancing about in a way which would have been irresistibly funny if the audience had not been too frightened to stop and witness it. As it happened, a general panic seized the multitude, and off went a good part of the population of Caneville, howling, screaming, and yelping to their various homes, where they, of course, each gave a different version of the story. The learned pig alone, and his faithful Tom, who would not run away for anybody, were the only creatures who stood their ground. The former, because he had traveled much and was acquainted with the peculiarities of bears, and the latter, partly for the reason just given, and in part because he was so fixed to the drum that to go away without it was impossible, and to go away with it, without previous packing, would have been equally difficult, so he stood his ground and watched the proceedings. On the ceasing of the music and dispersing of the crowd, our hero also stood still, as much surprised as any of the former spectators at the effect he had produced, and then, feeling still more sensibly the effects of his fatigues, he sat down, panting and exhausted. The pig, who had been quietly watching him, and had evidently been revolving some interesting thoughts in his contemplative brain, shortly after arose, and, gathering up the things which were to have figured in his evening's performance, and assisting to pack the drum comfortably on Tom's back, beckoned to the bear and waddled gently off in an opposite direction of the city to that where Bruin had entered. Our interesting brute hesitated a moment, but, being nudged by Tom, who uttered at the same time a word or two of encouragement, which, to render intelligible, may be translated by, "Come along, stupid," he mechanically followed this fast young dog, and they all reached the pig's habitation just as evening was falling. After the bear had been regaled with a most hearty supper, for pigs, it may be remarked by the way, are famous caterers, his learned host unfolded to him his plans. He explained the nature of his own avocations, how that he had supported himself, and saved a nice little store besides, through telling the fortunes and relating the age of the lady dogs and doglets of Caneville, and how he performed sundry conjuring tricks, which, though easy enough when found out, had earned for him an astonishing reputation among the simple animals of the city, who never had penetrated the secret. He explained, besides, that there were many more he could perform, if his figure were more slim and his movements as active as they had been some years ago, before time, by increasing his rotundity, had lessened the ease of his motions, but that, if Bruin would undertake to learn them, his fortune was as good as made, for he, Herr Schwein, would not only teach him all he knew, but would reward him with half the profits derived from his performance, when he should have mastered his studies. This proposal so jumped with Bruin's humor that he consented without further solicitation, and it was agreed that his engagement should commence for the following day. With the morning sun did our hero's lessons begin, and, as nature had not added stupidity to his various weaknesses, he made really rapid progress. but poor Piggy found it dreadfully hard work, and more than once repented his bargain, for, though reflection and circumstances had made him a philosopher, and travelling had taught him experience, it required all his philosophy and his utmost skill to support the weight of Bruin's unhandsome temper and prevent an utter breach between them. Pride, however, and a natural wish to reap the harvest which he had sown at the cost of so much pains and labour, induced him to persevere, and the day at length arrived when Bruin was to make his next appearance in public. Since the first evening of his arrival he had kept strictly within his employer's grounds, and had familiarized his mind with the mouth-organ and the drum. But now the sun had risen that was to shine on him again abroad, he felt considerably elated, the idea of sporting a handsome pair of silk drawers, and a medal with a ribbon round his neck and a silver anklet, contributing not a little to produce the feeling. The pig, who knew the value of notoriety in such cases, had, from early morning, kept Tom parading the streets with a large placard over his shoulders announcing, "The arrival of a distinguished foreigner, engaged by Herr Schwein at ruinous expense, for a limited number of representations, to perform his extraordinary and intensely interesting feats before the highly discriminating public of Caneville." The highly discriminating, being thus prepared, assembled in the great square, the place chosen for the exhibition, long before the appointed hour. The ladies were arranged in the foremost rank, with a politeness that was perfectly edifying, whilst knots of fashionable dogs and cats got as near as possible to the reigning favourites. Curs of inferior degree occupied the outermost ranks, and a bird or two got gallery places above the heads of the animal spectators. It was when expectation was raised to that pitch, which usually finds vent in the most discordant cries, that Bruin, carrying a bag, followed by Tom with a drum, made his appearance, a sight which caused universal approbation. Some praised his evident strength, others admired his dress, and some again criticized his figure. But when he drew out from his bag a quantity of singular objects, and Tom struck up an extraordinary extempore air with variations on the pipes, accompanied by sundry vicious blows on the drum, public curiosity was strained to the utmost. When the music ceased, Bruin imperatively waved the spectators back, and the performance began. He handled a pair of knives in a way which made the beholders tremble, for those implements were swallowed and appeared again at the tips of his paws or the end of his nose, without doing him any injury, and they were forced into his arms, and drawn furiously across his throat, without causing the slightest wound. And then they were tucked into his waistband, and after sundry contortions and leaps and affected attitudes, they were pulled from out of his capacious jaws, where they had stuck fast, to the wonder and delight of the spectators. Then he took up 3 balls of polished brass, which seemed too heavy for any fashionable puppy present to lift, and commenced a wonderful series of exploits with them. Now they leaped a great height into the air, one after another, with a rapidity which made the crowd's eyes water. Then they ran over his shoulders and down his back and between his legs and over his shoulders again in a continuous stream. And then they went bumping over every projecting part of his body, leaping here, jumping there, now on the top of his head, now on the tip of his nose, and never falling to the ground, and always going this game with such wondrous swiftness as though there were 30 balls instead of 3. But the feat which pleased them most, and which may be called the crowning effort of the display, was when Bruin balanced a short stick on his forehead with a pewter plate on top of it, which, by some mysterious agency, was made to spin round and dazzle the optics of the crowd as it glittered in the sun. At this marvelous sight there was a burst of admiration. Tom blew at his pipes and hammered at his drums with the utmost energy. 2 well-dressed young dogs, who had been paying particular attention to a tall young lady with a long, sentimental nose, over which a veil dropped gracefully, she was evidently one of the aristocratic greyhound family, gaped with wonder as they stared at the whirling pewter. The young lady herself looked on with a gaze where surprise and admiration were singularly mingled, and the curs, who are less accustomed to restrain their feelings, gave vent to them in vigorous howls. The success was, indeed, complete, and when Tom went round with the plate, A rich harvest amply repaid the pains which had been bestowed on the rehearsals. End of chapter 3. Read by Nancy Cochran Gergen, Gilbert, Arizona, January 14, 2023.